All right, so this is lecture number 7. And the topic here is Buffo, which I am posing as a standard upper-level ontology, primarily for scientific research. We will discuss in the final lecture some aspects of Buffo which are being applied in other non-scientific domains, but the primary origin of Buffo was working as an ontologist with people in the domain of biomedicine, and they contributed in some ways to Buffo. They helped to test Buffo. Buffo is, like every ontology, a work in progress, and it does not claim to be complete. No ontology should claim to be complete. And there are a number of areas where we are aware that we need to do more work, and we are attempting to do that work, but we think we have a good starting point. Now, the slides for this lecture are available here. If anyone does not have this extra set of slides, then they should their hand up. Good. So the idea behind Buffo is ontological realism. That idea means that before you build any kind of representational artifact in an area like biological or medical research, then you should look at the world before you start to create your representational system. And look at the world means look at the best scientific theory or theories, established scientific theories, and then you build your data model or your ontology or your information model in such a way that experts in the domain help you test the adequacy of the representation that you're developing. Now, scientific ontologies, which is what we're primarily interested in here, have special features as contrasted with what might call administrative ontologies created by companies or by governments, by administrations within a university, for instance, where the classes or categories or types which are in the ontology may be created by the designers of the ontology. In science, the ontology should not create any types or kinds or universals. On the contrary, it should include in the ontology only those universals which are such that there is good reason to believe that they correspond to entities in reality. In other words, there is good reason to believe that they have instances in reality. And every type in Buffo is such that we have good reason to believe that it has instances in reality. And we will not include types in Buffo for which that good reason does not exist. This is one of the reasons why we're hesitant about extending Buffo into the realm of mathematics, because it's not clear that mathematical entities like number have instances in reality. So we are scientific in the sense in which mathematics is not scientific. Now, scientists are interested in instances. They do experiments on instances. They observe instances, but their results are not results about instances. The results are results about what is general. So the scientist is not interested in this electron or that electron. The scientist is interested in the universal electron. And for scientific ontologies, as contrasted with, for instance, a bank ontology, reusability and openness is of first importance. Every scientific ontology should be a public domain artifact which can be reused by any other person, by any other scientist. Intelligibility to human beings is crucial because some human beings will not be experts in the formal aspects or the computational aspects of ontology, but they will have scientific knowledge which is relevant to constructing and criticizing, checking the ontology. Because there are people who are criticizing and checking the ontology has to be revisable, and it has to thereby embrace also an open world assumption, which means that it never claims to be complete, because we might always find new subtypes of the types that we've already recognized in the ontology, or we may find a need to extend the ontology into new domains orthogonal to the domains that we've already considered. We have to have a way of testing the ontology, which is like the way we test scientific theories in multiple ways. And we need to ensure that our ontology is compatible with the ontologies being built for neighboring scientific domains. And one aspect of this is that we can't add a new term to our ontology without first checking that it's not already been added in someone else's ontology, and without checking that we add it compatibly with what relevant other neighboring ontologies might say. Now, for scientific ontologies also, I believe, the use is not relevant for determining entities in the ontology. So scientific ontologies are often developed because people in science have good ideas which can only be addressed by building an ontology. They have a specific puzzle in mind, specific problem, and they build the ontology to help them solve the problem. But if they build the ontology in such a way that its content is determined by that specific problem, it will be a bad ontology, very likely. And what that means is that it will be a representation of some domain which someone else who has a different problem but who is interested in that same domain will find useless. In order to guarantee maximal usability, we need to forget about use. And we need to concentrate exclusively on finding a good representation of the domain in hand. Now, this is a very difficult balance because, of course, you might spend the next 100 years being very, very, very precise about the different kinds of deviations from the norm of fingernails, for instance. There might be millions of different ways in which fingernails can be dirty or cracked or missing, or you could go on forever. And that's probably not a good way of spending your time, even though it might be a really adequate representation. So you have to balance energy invested against output, but you should not try to make that balance by focusing on some narrow problem that you're faced with in a given situation. You should always focus on getting the representational content of your ontology in good order. Now, Buffo is a simple top-level ontology designed to support these ends as thus described. In other words, it's designed to support information integration in scientific research. That's not its use. That's the etiology of it. So we had these problems of integrating scientific research. The Buffo community, which is a growing community, decided that the best way to meet this need was to forget about the need and try and produce a good representation of highly general ontological structures which are manifested in practically every domain of scientific research. And one of the consequences of this, we hope, is that it will help people to build on ontologies in such a way that they're consistent, at least at the top level, and also non-redundant at the top level. Now, Buffo is based on three fundamental dichotomies. There's the dichotomy between continuance and occurrence, the dichotomy between what is dependent and what is independent, and the dichotomy between types or universals or kinds on the one hand, and instances of these types on the other hand. So this dichotomy we've seen already. On this side we have things like planets, qualities like redness, and on this side we have processes like my arm movement. Continuance therefore have two subtypes, thing continuance and quality continuance. And each quality depends on something which is its bearer. And an example of a quality would be my redness, my suntan, my temperature, my headache, and so forth. Each event or process depends upon things as its participants. And this is the same dependence relation, which is present here and here. And Buffo includes these relations, which are collected together in the relation ontology, as a proper part. And then there is, in addition, the relation between instances and types. So these are the instances down here. These are the types. So my arm movement, which is this instance here, instance number 4396, is an instance of the Buffo type occurrence. And the fact that we have instances and types, along with relations between types, such as the is-our relation, means that we in fact have three kinds of relations. We have relations like is-our and part of, as in human heart, part of human, which are relations between what is general, in type. We have relations between an instance and a type, such as this human, namely me, is an instance of the type human, or this human is allergic to the type Tamiflu. There's another example of a relation between an instance and a type. And then we have relations between instances, such as Mary's heart is part of Mary, or Mary's aorta is connected to Mary's heart. The part of relation here and the part of relation here are logically extinct. And the definitions of these relations can be found in the paper on the relation ontology, which I believe is referred to in a later slide, which will explain why we have to recognize that these relations are logical. It's here already. So this is the paper. And this is an example from the gene ontology. This is a part of relation. So the nucleus is a part of the intracellular, which is a part of the cell, which is a kind of cellular component. The nucleus is a kind of intracellular membrane-bound organelle, which is a kind of membrane-bound organelle, which is a kind of organelle, which is a kind of cellular component. And type-level relations here presuppose instance-level relations, kinds of relations that we can observe in the laboratory. So to say that the type A is part of the type B is to say that all instances of A are instance-level parts of some instance of B. So to say that human heart is part of human is to say that every human has a heart. So every human heart is part of some human. And you could also have every human has a heart, which would be all instances of A are such that there is some instance of B which has that instance level, which has that instance of A as an instance level part. And then similarly, has participant as a type level relation we can define as follows. To say that A has participant B is to say that all instances of A have an instance of B as instance level participant, as for instance, cell binding has participant cell. So, and now we have a strategy for creating ontologies from the top down, which is a strategy which is being exploited by multiple biological and biomedical ontologies already. So we import Buffo into Protégé, for instance, and then we need to include in our ontology biological macromolecule. Every biological macromolecule is an object in the Buffo terms. There is no lower level Buffo type which is such that biological macromolecule falls under it as a child, and so we insert biological macromolecule in Protégé as an immediate child of object in our ontology, and then we continue populating downwards to create the ontology. This is how the cell ontology, protein ontology, various other ontologies, the infectious disease ontology, are being built as we speak. And of course, the advantage is that because all of these different ontologist groups are using the same strategy, they learn lessons about what obstacles to avoid, what mistakes they may make, which they can then transmit to the other people using the same methodology. And also the ontologies that they create work well together because they're created using the same top level. And gradually we're developing also a cadre of people who are trained in this kind of work who can then be used to speed up the development of ontologies in new domains as they become confronted with the need for a controlled vocabulary for representing data. So when we started in all of this, it was typical for there to be 16 maze ontologies developed in 16 different research groups in 16 different ways, and all of them were no good. So ontology is not something that people should do alone without public supervision. They should do ontology as part of a coordinated effort involving other people who've been doing it and learning how to do it over a period of time. Also, one advantage of having this cadre of people who have experience in building ontologies is that you also have people who have experience in criticizing ontology. And one of the reasons why people were doing VAD work in the olden days is because there were no people around who had any basis upon which to criticize their work. And you only get good work if you have people who have a basis for criticism. And then also this strategy creates innovations. So we now have a strategy called myriotting, which is a strategy for incorporating into one ontology specific terms which are needed to make that ontology work, which properly live in another ontology. The myriot means a minimal information or reuse of an external ontology term. So Buffo has been used in various degrees by various groups around the world. The W3C, Healthcare and Life Sciences Special Interest Group, has a project called the Pharma Ontology, which is based on Buffo. There is a European medical record system called Medicognos, which is being tested, which is a potential input to the Microsoft Health Vault medical record system, which is based on Buffo. It's being used by the Cleveland Clinic Semantic Database, by the Major Histocompatibility Complex Ontology, by the Neuroscience Information Framework Standard, which is a large suite of ontologies in neurology and neuroscience. There are a series of ontologies like the interdisciplinary prostate ontology and the nanoparticle ontology and the ontology for risks against patient safety, which are being developed using Buffo. The National Cancer Institute has reinitiated funding for a big project called the Biomedical Grid Terminology, which is based on Buffo. The U.S. Army is funding research, which we're involved here in Buffalo, and which we'll talk about in the final lecture, which involves an important input from Buffo. We have an ontology for general medical science, which I will talk about in a few minutes, as an illustration of how Buffo helps to create clarity in areas hitherto marked by murkiness. We have several infectious disease ontologies which have been developed by population downwards from the infectious disease ontology core, which was in turn created by populating downwards from Buffo. And then we have all the ontologies in the Obo Foundry attempt to create a suite of interoperable representations of different parts of the domain of the life sciences, ranging from biological processes in the gene ontology down to RNA molecules in the RNA ontology. And these are organized like this. So we've seen this picture before. The yellow parts are the gene ontology. This is granularity. So we have very small things here, and we have larger things like organs and populations and organisms here. And then the organization along this axis is just the organization which we have from Buffo, which is no accident, because it was the distance of the Buffo upper level ontology which made the Foundry possible as a view of how we could organize modular ontology development across a large domain. The Buffo is maintained by a number of people. These are the most active in the group of people who help to keep the Buffo show on the road. And I would say half of these people are engaged primarily in biomedical applications of Buffo. That's the Poisters, Mungall, and Rottenberg. Grunot and Neuhaus are both former philosophers who I think I can properly describe now as being no longer philosophers. And Holger is a computer scientist. Now, Buffo was inspired, again, by a number of people, including Guarino, as we talked about earlier, by a German logician by the name of Degen, and by a British computer scientist, artificial intelligence person who was also a former philosopher, who now has a manic hatred of philosophers for reasons which I do not understand. But he was one of the leaders in the early field of ontology within the artificial intelligence world, and who created a very influential. I read it and was influenced, and it influenced a lot of other people. Paper on the ontology of liquids, which I strongly recommend. But there were also philosophical inspirations and one biological inspiration. So there was, first of all, Aristotle, as I hope is clear by now. Husserl had the idea of formal ontology. This idea, without formal ontology as Husserl conceived it, basic formal ontology wouldn't exist. Roman Ingarden was Husserl's most important student. He was a Polish philosopher whose major work on ontology in 4 volumes, unfortunately, was never translated into English. It was published in Polish and in German. Fragments of Volume 1, which I strongly recommend, have been published under the title Time and Modes of Being. But the major contributions of Ingarden have still to be exposed in the language of science. Ingvar Johansson is a Swedish philosopher who wrote a book called Ontological Investigations, which is very much inspired by the same spirit as inspires Buffo, and it's another book that I strongly recommend. Kevin Mulligan in the University of Geneva was the person who persuaded me of the importance of Husserl's ideas on ontology. And Peter Simons is somebody who wrote a very important book on Mariology, which again inspired a number of the elements in Buffo. And then Cornelius Ross is an anatomist, the primary author of the foundational model of anatomy. I used to tell people that the foundational model of the anatomy is the one true thing in biomedical ontology, because it is structured so well in comparison with the other ontologies which existed then, which is to say 4 or 5 years ago when I first started working with biomedical ontologies. Cornelius Ross would, I think, explain the reasons why the FMA has these highly positive features by pointing out that he studied Aristotle when he was in school. And then there are a whole series of important user groups. So the Björn Peters, who is the OBO representative of the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, is one. And the OB ontology has played an important role in criticizing Buffo because it doesn't meet the needs of OB. And we are gradually finding ways of meeting the needs of OB without departing from the Buffo principles, which are very strict principles, because it will only work if we follow strict. And I mentioned just one more person here, which is Kent Spackman, who is the editor-in-chief of the SNOMED Standard Nomenclature for Medicine. And Kent is instituting, along with colleagues such as Stefan Schultz, a move to make SNOMED, which is designed to be a worldwide medical ontology artifact, compatible with Buffo. The goal is that some of the present problems with some of the terms in SNOMED will be resolved by making Buffo be the organizing architecture for at least major parts of SNOMED. If that happens, that will be a very significant achievement, because SNOMED really is a huge worldwide project in an important area. So back to Buffo, there are two kinds of dependent continuant, two broad families of dependent continuant. One of them is quality, which we can think of as inert dependent continuant. Quality is something like a color or a weight or a length. But then on the other side are what we call realizable dependent continuants. And an example of a realizable dependent continuant would be, for instance, a plan. Plan can get realized. Or a function can get executed. Or a role, you play a role. And then these are all continuants, and their realizations, executions, expressions, exercises are occurrent. So this means that the Buffo process hierarchy and the Buffo continuant hierarchy are connected through processes of realization. So dispositions, which are one example of realizable dependent continuants, are realized in processes of realization which are occurrent. There is a dependence relation between the process of realization and the realizable dependent continuant, which gets realized. And this relation is the same relation that we've met before. It's the relation of specific dependence. What this means is that A specifically depends on B if A is necessarily such B ceases to exist and A ceases to exist. That's the instance level. On the type level, anything of type A specifically depends on something of type B. For every instance A of A, there is some instance B of B such that A ends on B in this instance level. So we see depends on here, and we saw this yesterday. So now we have independent continuance here, dependent continuance here, and occurrence here. So it's the same structure that we met when we were talking about the Aristotelian ontological sextet. But now we have a wider family of dependent continuants, and really everything else is the same. So everything which is here still applies Buffo as I am now presenting it. So qualities, roles, dispositions, functions, and so forth are specifically dependent continuants. If you're a lecturer, then the reason why you're a lecturer is not because you're a specific subkind of, an instance of a specific subkind of Homo sapiens. You're just a Homo sapiens, but you have a specific kind of role, which is the lecturer role, which you get to play occasionally. Now, qualities are the qualities that you see in the lab when you examine a fly's eye, for instance, and note that it has a redness phenotype. What you see is an instance. You see an instance of redness which depends on an instance of eye in this particular fly. This particular quality instance instantiates the universal quality redness. This particular eye instance instantiates the universal eye. Is an independent continuant. And more specifically, eye is a child of anatomical structure, just as red is a child of color. So this is specifically dependent continuance. If the bearer ceases to exist, then its quality or function or role ceases to exist. So if I cease to exist, then the color of my skin ceases to exist. My weight ceases to exist, and so forth. And in addition to specifically dependent continuants, we also, however, have generically dependent continuants. Now, the idea of generically dependent continuants comes about as follows. If I have a PDF file on my laptop, then that PDF file is a quality of the bearer of the information, the hard drive or whatever it might be. My hard drive is patterned in a certain way, and those patterns, those kinds of patterns are quality. And it's a continuant. It's a dependent continuant because if my hard drive is destroyed, then the PDF file is also destroyed. But of course, I might have copied it beforehand. I might have put the PDF file on another hard drive. Now, those kinds of things which can be copied are called, those kinds of dependent continuance patterns which can be copied are called generically dependent continuance. You cannot copy a headache. You can't copy the redness of the eye of a fly. But you can copy a PDF file or a DNA sequence. And these are called, respectively, sequences on the one hand and information objects on the other hand. And the Buffo approach to information objects is via the category of generically dependent continuity. So this is the picture that we have so far. Not all of the things you see here are parts of Buffo. These are not parts of Buffo, but they are illustration. This is not part of Buffo, but an illustration. So we have continuance, some of which are independent continuance. The most important of those are things which are unitary independent continuance. Then we have specifically dependent continuance, which include qualities and realizables, specifically roles, dispositions, and functions, which are a special kind of disposition. And then we have functionings, that are a special kind of occurrent, which are those occurrences which arise when functions such as pumping. My heart has the function to pump blood, function creating currents called pumpings. Now, a role is what we call in the Buffo world an externally grounded realizable entity. So a role is something like the teacher role or the nurse role or the doctor role or the lecturer role or the food role or the drug role. It's something which a physical entity bears because it's in some special physical or social or institutional circumstances. Nothing is a nurse for reasons of physical structure. They are a nurse because they have a certain qualification and they have certain rights to engage in processes of certain sorts in certain kinds of places. So roles correspond closely to what we called status functions when dealing with Searle's ideas on social ontology yesterday. And then the important thing about roles is that they're always optional. That is to say, you can always lose a role without being physically changed. So you can cease to be a nurse. That doesn't change you physically in any way, necessarily. A disposition is an internally grounded realizable entity. So this is a realizable entity which the entity has because it's physically so. So I have a disposition to go bald because my DNA is physically such that there is a certain process which is going to be unfolding in the course of time, in virtue of which I will lose my hair. So dispositions are not optional. If I somehow lose my disposition to go bald, then that will only be because some drug is invented which can reverse this process. You can stand up and use the microphone.
I think the wrong word was only. I think you lose that disposition also when you are bald. You are not bald.
Okay, yes, I agree. Then I really am physically changed. I couldn't be bald without physically changing. But dispositions need triggers. Very often, not all of them need triggers, but most of them need triggers, and very often we can record information about what the triggers are, which realize disposition. And the obvious example here is the disposition of a glass vase to break when dropped. And here the trigger is the dropping event. And then finally, we have functions which are special dispositions. They are those dispositions which are designed in the case of artifacts, for instance, screwdriver function, or selected for in the case of organs, for instance, within organisms. So the heart is selected as that which realizes the blood pumping function in organisms like you and me. So a function is a disposition that exists in virtue of the bearer's physical makeup but whereby this physical makeup is something the bearer possesses because it came into being either through natural biological or through intentional design in order to realize processes of a certain kind. So functions are designed or selected disposition. And then the parts of the organisms are the things which have been selected for. So my heart is a product of a selection process going back through many generations. And the selection process has brought it about that there are organs and smaller parts within my body whose job is to ensure that the various qualities of my body remain within a certain spectrum of allowed values, and that my organs respond appropriately should any of my qualities, for instance, my temperature, go outside this spectrum of allowed value. Yes?
Have a vision and also tend.
So we are at the point where we are preparing a new release of Buffo 2.0. The function, disposition, role terms are not present in Buffo 1.1, which is the version that is the credited version at the moment. Now, one of the reasons why we are still working on this is precisely because we don't know whether to include other subtypes of disposition other than function. One of these is tendency, another is capability. And my suspicion is that we will just include function as a disposition. That doesn't mean that we deny that there are tendencies and capabilities, because Buffo is an open world assumption. So if people need those terms, they can oscillate them for their own purposes and hang them from realizable or from disposition according to the definitions they. And now we can start looking at No, we can't. Yes.
I had a question. Are values?
Yes, so I used the word value in that slide, but actually Buffo does not recognize a distinction between attributes and values. So there is a strong tradition within the database world, which is called the entity attribute value tradition, which actually Guarino's Dolce approach is very much, I think, inspired by the entity attribute value tradition. This says that when we talk about colors or temperatures, for instance, we have the entity, which is the organism, we have the attribute, which is the temperature, and we have the value, which is 97 degrees. And when we say that this eye has color red, then we have eye color red, entity attribute value. Now, the problem with the entity attribute value approach is that some people think that something is an attribute, which other people think is a value. So some people would say color is the entity, red is the attribute, dark is the value, because this color is a dark red color. Where other people say eye is the entity, color is the attribute, and red is the value. Another example would be some people say organism eats peanut butter sandwich, where organism is the entity, eats is the attribute, and value is the peanut butter sandwich is the value, where someone else might say organism has practice eating. So organism is the entity, has practice is the attribute, and eating is the value. Now, these kinds of optionalities and miscalibrations are precisely what ontology is designed to avoid. And so in order to avoid these miscalibrations, we just identify what is going on here in terms of a hierarchy, which is a single hierarchy. So we have color, red color, dark red color. Dark red color is a kind of color, a kind of red, which is a kind of color, and we don't need to distinguish between attributes and values. Now, this approach faces problems when we move to deal with quantities like 97 degrees. But we believe that we have a strategy for solving the quantitative attributes or quality. The person who was just about to ask a question, was your question resolved?
Here, I'm somewhat confused about the difference between a process and information artifact, because it seems that you could have a information artifact which implements or which is isomorphic to a process, like a software object, like a source code as compared to the executable.
Yeah, good. So a piece of source code is indeed an information artifact, and this is a continuant, as is proved by the fact that it can survive from one day to the next identically. But when you execute it, then you create occurrence, which are execution. Now, the reason why you create the source code is because you want to create the executions. So there is a close connection between the two, but still, ontologically speaking, I think the distinction is clear. Yeah, so I believe that if one looks at the terminologies which are being used to describe what's going on in those programming language contexts, then one will be able to unpack certain ambiguous uses of words like process in such a way that one can make them compatible with buffer. The fact that people use jargon in certain ways should not be taken to imply that they are doing something which is incompatible with Buffo, and therefore Buffo has this weakness, nor should it imply that they are stupid. I think that part of the problem with Deborah McGinnis and Natasha Noy's wine ontology is not that they're doing something wrong. It's just that they're doing it using a certain jargon, which I am not understanding. And I think part of my my role as the person who says this emperor does not have any clothes is to force people to be a bit clearer in their documentation, particularly when they're trying to provide a guidance service for new people who are entering into domain. There you should try and avoid using jargon in ways which non-aficionados might find. All right, so let's do disease now. This is a big problem, and the absence of a clear understanding of disease is one of the reasons why large medical terminologies like SNOMED have faced problems in their development, as one can demonstrate by looking at the number of changes that SNOMED has been forced to make in successive versions when they had to correct errors. So if you look at the standard resources, the definitional resources for a definition of disease, you get various more or less satisfactory answers. So one common answer is to say a disease is something like a state in which a functional part of the body is no longer in a healthy condition. But then what is a state? Sometimes a disease is defined as just a synonym of illness. Sorry, that was the use-mentioned confusion. Sometimes the term disease is defined by stating that it is a synonym of the term illness. Sometimes the disease is defined as a process. So a state is one thing, but a process is another thing. This is a very silly definition of disease, but the idea that a disease is a process is a very common one. And then sometimes the disease is defined as a condition. This again is a very silly definition. But the idea that a disease is a pathological condition is again a very common one. These ideas, we need to get clear and work out which ones are correct and to what degree. And when we look at the main terminological artifacts, like the International Classification of Diseases or SNOMED, for health in this regard, then we discover that there are in fact 4 different kinds of classificatory tasks which are being addressed by these artifacts. So, first of all, some people need to classify people. So if you're doing public health statistics and the World Health Organization International Classification of Diseases, or ICD, was devised initially as a tool for organizing public health statistics, then you're really interested in classifying patients. Patients with diabetes, patients with influenza, patients with TB, and so forth, are the classes which ICD is organized in terms of. Unfortunately, ICD then creates new classes like patient with TB, which was identified through inspection of sputum, or patient with TB, which was identified through bacteriological analysis, or they don't have this one, but they could have, patient with TB, which was diagnosed on a Wednesday. Now, the problem is that ICD then lists that particular thing, namely TB identified on a Wednesday, as a special kind of TB, because it's called an international classification of diseases. And because of that, people think that TB is a very strange classification of diseases. But considered as a classification of patients, it's actually doing its job. I won't say it's in order as it stands, but it's doing its job. But then one might want to classify diseases, properly speaking, and then you need to understand what diseases are, and you need to understand that there is a distinction between a disease and a case of a disease in a specific patient, which might be identical to an instance of a disease, and so forth. But then you need to distinguish all of these things from the course of a disease, which is a process unfolding in time in a given patient, maybe a longer or a shorter process, depending on what kind of disease is involved. And then finally, we have records, data, diagnoses, and various other kinds of representations of disease. And the problem is that for a long time, medical terminologies were developed and similar resources were developed in which these four tasks were scrambled together in a confused way. And in some circles, they still are confused. But from the buffer point of view, these things are very clearly distinguishable. So we have patients, which are independent continuants. We have diseases, which are specifically dependent continuants. We have causes of disease, which are occurrence. And we have representations of diseases or causes or people, which are generically dependent. So we can keep these things very clearly separate. And recall the definition of a disposition. A disposition is a realizable entity which is such that if it ceases to exist, then its bearer is physically changed, and what its realization occurs in virtue of the bearer's physical makeup when this bearer is in some special physical circumstance. Now, we're going to use that definition in order to help us to define disease. First, we need to define another term, which is the term disorder. So what happens when you're diseased is that you have something wrong with your body. For instance, you have cells which are dividing too rapidly, or you have bacteria which are adhering to your cells. That thing which is wrong in your body is a part, not of your body necessarily, but of your extended body. So we can define your extended body to be your body plus all of the things which are located inside of it. For instance, all pieces of shrapnel from a war injury, or bacteria or viruses, or the food that you've just been eating. That's the extended body. And a disorder is some part of this extended body which is wrong somehow. And I will define wrong as best I can in a minute. Now, the first step towards understanding in what way it's wrong is to say that it's the bearer of a disposition of a certain sort. So a glass vase is the bearer of a disposition to break because of the physical makeup of the glass vase. A vase made of aluminium would not have the disposition to break because its physical structure is different from the structure of the vase. All right, so this is a disorder. Something wrong around here. We don't know precisely where the boundaries of the disorder are, but that's part of the nature of disorders. Also part of the nature of knowledge. We say it's a fiat object part for a number of reasons. First of all, because we don't know where it starts and stops. But secondly, because it's growing. So the very same disorder may start as being a very small thing, but then for various reasons, it spreads And it may spread by sending out representatives to other parts of your body which are not physically connected. We also say a fiat object because it may not have any physically discontinuous boundaries. So Mount Everest is here, I believe. But does it really start here, or does it start here? So we'd address this problem in a paper called "Do Mountains Exist?" And our conclusion is that yes, they do exist, but that they don't have bona fide physically discontinuous boundaries. They have fiat boundaries, like, for instance, downtown Santa Barbara. So this is another view of the same situation. This is the view that I want to defend of what diseases are represented pictorially. So we have a healthy organism. This healthy organism becomes disordered at a fine-grained level. Maybe just a few cells are going wrong. And at this point, those cells are active in certain ways. So they are engaging in processes which we can call preclinical manifestations. Preclinical means before the stage at which they become manifest to clinical observations. But we already have a disorder, and the patient performs constant self-assessments, as we do, and the result is there are no signs and symptoms. So the patient, poor chappie, thinks he's healthy. But then, a few weeks later, the disorder has become bigger or more intense, and now we have symptoms, which the patient on self-assessment represents as symptoms. He starts to worry because he has clinical manifestations, which means he starts to experience things of a sort which would make him think that he should go to a clinic to see a doctor. And even small babies can have those experiences. They just can't express the nature of it. Even animals have those. They just can't express the desire to go to see a doctor. And then the patient goes to see the doctor, and the doctor performs a physical exam, which gives rise to a representational artifact, generically dependent continued, called a clinical finding. This clinical finding suggests the need for a certain kind of lab test. So a specimen is taken from the patient. This is another independent continuant, and it's subjected to a lab test, which is an occurrent, which leads to another kind of information artifact, which is the lab finding. These together, the patient's representation of the symptoms to the doctor's clinical findings, the lab findings, together lead to clinical picture by the doctor, which is the starting point for an interpretive process which leads to a diagnosis, perhaps in a cyclical sequence, because the original diagnosis was refuted by a lab test, so you perform more lab tests until you find a diagnosis which is not refuted by the lab tests, and then you form a patient management plan which leads to treatment, and then gradually the patient is healthy again, if you're lucky. So this is the story, and then the question is, what is a disease? And the answer is that already here, you almost certainly have the disease. And what that means is that you have the disposition for these pathological processes to take place, which together form the disease course, and which include things like clinical manifestations in the form of symptoms and in the form of signs which the doctor can recognize in a clinical examination. Now, we can present the whole view once again. A disease is a disposition rooted in a physical disorder in the organism that is realized in pathological processes. We have an etiological process, typically, which produces a disorder which bears a disposition which is realized in pathological processes which produce abnormal bodily features, such as an expanded heart, which are recognized as signs and symptoms, which are used in the interpretative process, which produces a diagnosis. Now, this is at least a coherent picture, and it seems to work well with regard to a whole series of different kinds of disease. But before we look into that, are there any questions at this stage?
Well, the disease exists in reality, but the diagnosis is a speech act, or
That's getting there, yes. So the diagnosis exists as a result of a speech act on the part of the doctor, which gets recorded, and then usually we would say that that the result of the diagnostic process is a diagnosis, which is an information artifact which can survive and be criticized by others as
this slide that has it mentioned that, or that says that this fiat object part, or the organism, in the case of progressive diseases, typically grows larger through time.
in the case of progressive diseases, not. So sometimes diseases get cured very quickly, and then they get smaller.
Okay, because I was thinking of genetic disorders, mental.
I'm coming to those.
Oh, okay.
I don't think I'm coming to mental disorders in a way which you will find entirely satisfactory, but then you can stand up again. Yep.
Where would the abstract objects fit in Buffo?
So this is
objects.
Yep. So this is a request I get every couple of weeks from the OB community. So the OB community is a community which is trying to build an ontology to represent everything which is involved in an experiment. Our experiments include lots of measurement, and those measurements give rise to outputs called measurement results. And to express those measurement results, you need to use numbers. And so they say to me, how can we represent numbers in Buffo? And the first answer I say is, well, Buffo does not claim to represent everything, and maybe we will add numbers at some stage. But I never do add numbers. For various reasons. But the main reason, I think, is that why should we create a new arithmetic? We have perfectly good arithmetic.
I mean, other than
we understand arithmetic.
Well, I mean, like the abstract, the social objects.
Okay, why does Buffo not include social objects? There, I think, again, the answer is that that's a lower level activity, and we are beginning gradually to understand social ontology, and we'll see some of this in the next lecture. But it's not part of Buffo because it's too specific. Buffo is really meant to be excruciatingly general. So as soon as you start doing something which is specific to some one domain or to some family of domains, you've left the realm of Buffo and you're dealing with specialist domain ontology. Any more questions? Yep.
Well, I understand that social philosophy is lower, but the definition at the higher level should work even.
Absolutely.
But when you define function and disposition, it seems that this is not going to work for the social philosophy.
Good. Give me a counterexample.
Well, I can have a government that has functions, but this doesn't mean that it exists in virtue of the borough's physical makeup and so on.
That's a good example. I will write it down. So since we're going to be talking about those kinds of things in lecture 8, I will I'll do my best to find an answer for you before we get through lecture. But I've written it down. That's the first step towards progress sometime. All right. Now, in discussing these various things, I used various technical terms, some of which we've defined, but I'm going to elucidate them a little bit further here. So a bodily feature is a physical component of this extended body, or it's a bodily quality, or it's a bodily process. So a bodily feature includes basically those kinds of things that can go wrong in your body, or the things that they manifest themselves in terms of, for instance, qualities, elevated temperatures, or the processes that they manifest themselves. For instance, manifest themselves in, for instance, processes of feeling pain. And the disposition, we've already defined it, but for present purposes, we can think of it as some kind of propensity or tendency. And then we're going to talk about things as being clinically abnormal. And a bodily feature is clinically abnormal if it satisfies the following conditions. First of all, it's not part of the life plan for an organism of the relevant type. So getting old is not clinically abnormal. Becoming pregnant is not clinically abnormal. Menopause is not clinically abnormal. So not everything which is associated with processes like pain process is clinically abnormal. However, what is clinically abnormal must be causally linked to something like pain processes or feelings of illness or to death or dysfunction or discomfort. There has to be something bad about the bodily feature in this sense if it's to be correctly classified as clinically abnormal. But then thirdly, this is the really hard one. What is clinically abnormal is a matter of a threshold, which is normally not a discontinuity in a continuum, but rather it's arbitrarily selected. So hypertension is a term used for people whose blood pressure is regularly above a certain level because there's something wrong with their bodies. But what that level is changes from culture to culture. It's a matter of an arbitrary fiat decision. Now, sometimes we make an explicit fiat decision because it's important, because we have to decide who we're going to prescribe drugs to, for instance. But sometimes there is no determinate threshold. It's a matter of what the doctor decides from day to day, or it's a matter of what the patient decides from day to day. So this isn't a problem. Baldness is exact. Mountains are like this too. Very many things in our reality are subject to these threshold phenomena. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that we're dealing with a threshold which is not a discontinuity. All right, so having said all of that, we can now define some terms. So a disorder is a physical component of this extended body that is clinically abnormal. Pathological process is a bodily process, a process within the organism that is a realization of a disorder and is clinically abnormal. So the process here is clinically abnormal. And the disease is a disposition to undergo pathological processes that, namely the disposition, exists in an organism because of one or more disorders in that organism. So you have a disease because you have a disorder, which is a physical change in your body, which is the bearer of dispositions to pathological processes. The disease is the disposition to pathological processes, but that disposition can be realized in multiple different ways according to your age, your gender, how many drugs you take, how good your doctor is, how lucky you are, what your genetics are like, what your environment is like. All of these will change the realization of your disease. So that, for instance, if you have exactly the right drugs and you take them regularly, you may have no symptoms at all, but you still have the disease. Now, that's a very, very subtle kind of ontological structure that we're dealing with. We're dealing with an ontological structure which exists, but which realizes itself in so many different manifold ways, which look ontologically very different from each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why terminological artifacts have had such difficulty in coming to grips with disease in a consistent way. And so very often, for instance, they confuse a disease, which is a very hard ontological nut to crack, with a diagnosis, which is a rather easy thing to get hold of. But of course, we have the danger now that we will create use-mention confusion. Well, what we mean by disease in one part of our database is a diagnosis, but in another part of our database, we talk about diseases being cured. You can't cure a diagnosis. So all diseases are dispositions. Basically, diseases are the bad disposition. So not all dispositions are diseases, because we also have good dispositions. For instance, the disposition to breathe. We also have predisposition, which are dispositions to get other dispositions. So if you have a predisposition to baldness, oh no, that's a predisposition to, give me a good example of a predisposition. Diabetes. So you have an elevated risk of diabetes. This is a disposition in an organism that constitutes an increased risk of the organism subsequently developing the disease diabetes. So to have this elevated risk is not yet to have the disease, but it is to have the disposition to have the disease. I didn't invent this. So there is a whole philosophical branch which deals with powers and disposition. And it's long been recognized that there are dispositions to have disposition. And it turns out that that's what people who are talking about susceptibility to disease are talking. All right, so now let's try some examples. Let's do cirrhosis of the liver, which is a disease of environmental exposure. It's caused by pubs. Or more precisely, it's caused by phenobarbital-induced hepatic cell death, which produces the disorder called a necrotic liver, which bears the disposition, which is the disease called cirrhosis, which is realized in a pathological process of abnormal tissue repair with cell proliferation and fibrosis that exceed a certain threshold, and of hypoxia-induced cell death. This produces abnormal bodily features which are recognized as fatigue, anorexia, jaundice, splenomegaly, and these signs and symptoms are used in an interpretive process which produces a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that this is probably cirrhosis, but we should try and rule out cirrhosis by doing a certain laboratory test. This laboratory test produces a test result that there are elevated liver enzymes in the serum, which is used in the interpretative process, which produces the result, which is a diagnosis that the patient has a disorder that bears the disease, cirrhosis. All right? Now we do influenza. The etiological process here is infection of the airway epithelial cells with influenza virus, which produces a disorder, which is viable cells which have the influenza virus. These bear a disposition called flu, which is realized in pathological processes of acute inflammation, which produce abnormal bodily features recognized as weakness, dizziness, and fever, which are used in the interpretive process, producing a hypothesis that we should do laboratory tests to rule out influenza, but the laboratory tests tell us that there are an elevated serum antibody titers, which are used in the interpretive process, whose result is a diagnosis that the patient has a disorder that bears the disease flu. Note that this disorder produces normal physiological processes of immune response when we try and kill the viruses, or anyway eliminate them, in order to eliminate the disorder. And often we're successful. And then there arises a question. If we get flu, in other words, if we have flu viruses inside our body, but we succeed in eliminating them through a normal physiological response, did we ever have flu? And I don't believe that we can give an answer to this question, not because of some epistemological shortfall, but because of the nature of disease. The nature of the disease is that there is no threshold that is determinate beyond which you can say that somebody had the disease. We're dealing here with a threshold phenomenon, which is a bit like the question of how big does a hill have to be before you can call it a mountain. And the United Nations probably has some rule for when things get to be called hills, but it could have had a different rule and it would have been an equally good rule. All right, now we'll do Huntington's disease. It's a genetic disease. And here the etiology is inheritance of a certain gene mutation. So these things are repeated in the HT gene, which produces a disorder which is chromosome 4 with abnormal MHTT, which bears the disposition called Huntington's disease. And you have this from conception. This is realizing pathological processes of gradual accumulation of certain protein fragments and so forth, which produce abnormal bodily features, which again gradually are recognized as anxiety, depression, and then difficulties in speaking and swallowing, which then produce this a hypothesis which suggests this laboratory test, which produce these test results, which are used in an interpretive process to bring about this diagnosis. Now, we can do this for any disease, and we're using the same ontological resources, basically the resources of Buffalo in each case, to describe diseases, complications of diseases, predispositions to diseases, which in the existing terminological resources are not consistently described. There's no coordination unless you have a framework like this. I'm willing to address criticism of the framework because it's not quite as tight as it should be, but the only point I want to make now is not that this framework is correct, but rather that a framework like this is needed to coordinate the way in which health data is collected. And the reasons are reasons that we've already met. If you don't have such a framework, then each new disease group will invent their own new way of doing things, and then their data will not interoperate with the data of all the other disease groups. Moreover, people will know how to start, and they can learn from the mistakes made by others. They can more easily reuse their data, and they won't create silo problems, the sort which we've been facing in the past. And this is one of the reasons why the gene ontology is so successful. The gene ontology has created just such a framework, which all biologists working in certain model organism biology types of experiments know that they are supposed to use. And the gene ontology was built on the basis of a strategy of low-hanging fruit. So you start off by creating an ontology using those terms which you could recognize already as being part of established biology. And gradually it grew and grew as more and more experts were brought in to deal with the more difficult cases. And along the way, lessons were learned about the best ways to build the ontology, to disseminate the ontology, to disseminate the rules governing the building of the ontology, so that you create a community who are doing this difficult work in a coordinated fashion and who are learning from each other. We need to create a similar community in the clinical domain. We didn't do that yet. And we can do it, I'm afraid, only if the artifacts that we're creating are built by people who know what they're talking about. I'm not one of those. So I could not do this for Huntington. This was done by Richard Scheuermann, who is one of my Oghams colleagues in Texas. But also, everything in the ontology must be based on real thinking. So it was hard to work out how diseases, pathological processes, disorders, and so on relate to each other. And that could not be done by automatic extraction of terms from some literature corpus. It can only be done by thinking very carefully about how definitions work. And I would say that definitions of disorder and disease which are used here took 10 days of hard thinking. These are about 16 definitions between Richard Scheuermann and myself in order to get the definitions into shape, into some rough shape, and then we've been working with other people since then to try and get them into a good enough shape to be recommended to broader audience. So now the benefits of Go. It's small, it's simple, it's been tested now over several years by heterogeneous groups, and it works at least in the domains of what we might think of as material science, so biology, physics, chemistry. It has a large community of users and the people who maintain it in multiple areas. We have a methodology for developing domain ontologies on its basis by populating downwards. We hope that everything in Buffalo is humanly intelligible, but we're always working on improving our definitions. It's compatible with the top level of Dolce, we believe, which it brings hope for some kind of union. And above all, it's a genuine top level, which does not tread on the territory of domain scientists. And I think that's the end of the penultimate lecture. So We have a few minutes for questions.
Just a quick question about when you go back to your categories for the diseases, what exactly is supposed to be the difference between the symptoms and the signs? Right, so
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's one of the questions that we have a good answer, but we are hesitant to recommend this answer without first doing a lot of careful, not sure what the good word is, preparation of the audience. So the words signs, symptoms, and findings are used in multiple confused and confusing ways in medical circles, and there is really no established terminology. Just as the words disorder, illness, disease, and so forth are used in multiple ways in medical circles. The idea is to find a way of regimenting this terminology, which will be based on ontologically coherent decisions. And the proposal that we embrace here, but which is somewhat too, it would be too quick to propose this for general use at this stage, is to say that a symptom is a manifestation, a symptom is a bodily feature. Actually, no, I can be even more careful. A symptom is an experience which a patient has. So it's an experience of tiredness, of nausea, of pain, of feeling bad, which only the patient could have. And which is such that it is of the type which an adult patient could reasonably identify as being potentially caused by a disease. Sounds very complicated, but it works quite well in a number of ways. First of all, this means that babies and animals can have symptoms. Because even though they can't identify those symptoms as being of a type which suggests disease, they are of a type which someone else could identify if they had exactly the same experience as being such. That's been a problem in the world of symptom ontology. The second virtue is that it creates an ontologically coherent category, namely the category of experiences. First-person subjective experience. So that's symptoms. Signs, we're not sure whether we will keep the word at all, but at the moment, signs are used for those things which the doctor discovers or the doctor identifies. So vital signs would be an example. He takes your pulse. You can identify them too, but primarily they're the sorts of things which doctors identify.
So that'd be the reason why, for instance, flu, fever is then a sign. It's not, because it's something I'm going to experience, but it's also something that
So you would experience feeling hot or feeling that you have a high temperature, but the doctor would, or you too, by taking your temperature, would identify objectively that you have an elevated temperature or fever. And then findings, I think we're certainly going to drop if something can be probably certain.
Could a symptom be considered the disorder at a higher level of granularity?
So a symptom is an experience, which is a process, which is an occurrence, where a disorder is a continuum, and nothing which is an occurrence at one level can be a continuum at another level. So the first answer to your question has to be no, but then give me an example of a symptom which you might think would be a disorder. So every symptom will rest on some disorder at a lower level, probably.
Tiredness.
You will be tired only because there's something afoot or amiss in your body, which is of a physical sort, which means that there's some physical part of your body which is wrong, which is disordered. That physical part of the body which is disordered, we call a disorder. So there always are associations. One of the axioms that underlies this approach, and this brings us back to your mental disease question, is that every disease rests upon some physical disorder in the organism. And that's true of every symptom, I think. Any more questions? You want to raise your question again, having heard? Do you buy this? He buys it. Any more? Go on, somebody should. Yes.
When one inside for threshold, is there any vision in the buffer?
No. So this idea of threshold phenomena applies to every buffer category. So there can be threshold phenomena relating to mountain boundaries or the boundary of downtown Santa Barbara is a threshold phenomenon. But there can also be threshold phenomena relating to processes like whether you went for a walk. So you go out, you tell your wife, I'm going for a walk, and you come back 28 seconds late. Did you go for a walk? That's a threshold. And there's no answer. You came back 2 seconds later, we could say, no, you didn't. You came back an hour later, we would say, of course you did, assuming you were walking. But if you come back 28 seconds late, did you go for a walk? That's a threshold phenomenon. Is he bald? That's a threshold phenomenon. But some people are clearly bald and some people are clearly not bald. So that's why there can be no Buffo category of threshold phenomenon, because it's a something which applies across every category. And Buffo's whole point is that we make these divisions which can never be crossed. Any more? Yep.
Just want to say that is it fair to say that Darwin natural selection of species could be the backbone of BFO?
So this is points to a more general problem. So there are people in the world of physics who are using Buffo, but most of the users of Buffo are biologists, and the biologists today base everything that they do on the Darwinian theory of natural selection. But I don't want Buffo to be tied to the biological domain. I want it to be more general than just biology, which is why I am concerned that it should work also for organizations, for instance. But I don't know that it will ever work, for instance, for quantum mechanics. So I think that there is a restricted range of applicability for Buffo, which includes, I hope, nearly all of biology, much of physics, I hope things like social science. And therefore, I don't want it to be tied to specific features of Darwinian natural. I want it to be compatible with Darwinian natural selection, but not tied to Darwinian natural. It should apply also to entities which exist for reasons which have nothing to do with natural.
Maybe I'm still just trying to have the grip of ontology, because I see Darwin in the sphere of biology to be very useful, and also Aristotelian definitions to be so much useful of species, because I see ontology trying to break things apart and actually come up with data that would make sense. That is the one way I understand ontology. So I'm just trying to see.
Yeah, good. So let me formulate the matter as follows. Aristotle was the dominant figure in Western philosophy for 2,000 years. And biology was inspired by Aristotle in multiple ways, to the degree that for a long time one could describe biology as being Linnaean biology. The big chunks of biology are building Linnaean categories. Linnaeus was inspired to build those category systems by Aristotle's theory of categories. Then came Darwin. Darwin showed that the Linnaean approach, which means the Aristotelian approach to biology, was not quite right. As a result of which, there was a phase in the history of biology when people tried to dump Linnaeus. They tried to dump the classificatory approach. And of course, there were some good reasons why they should attempt to dumplin it. But now, with the huge needs that we have to organize information in biology, the ontological ideas of Aristotle, which Linnaeus imbibed, are once again becoming important. Now, how those ontological ideas wed or match up with Darwinian ideas about natural selection is quite difficult. I have been using throughout these lectures the idea that John is an instance of man as an example of instantiation between an instance and the universal. But actually, I'm not sure that Homo sapiens is the name of a universe. I think that cell and organism are names of universal. I think electron is the name of a universal. But I'm not sure about Homo sapiens. I think that's a difficult story. And I hope that we will be able to have a clear, simple story, which is also correct within the near future. But at the moment, it's just a difficult story. All right, last question for this bit.
I'm interested in what your view is about the people who you describe in HL7 or let every ontology bloom. Why do you believe, what's the underlying hypothesis that they have, that doing that will lead to some kind of a coherent congealing into something that has fundamental value?
Okay, so I think there are two stories here. The HL7 story is about democracy. So the HL7 world is a huge world of separate groups, overlapping, but still separate groups who believe that decisions about a large, in fact, gigantic standard for health information can be made by having democratic vote. And I think that the reason they believe that is because they believe that the people who are working within the HL7 world are well-intentioned, well-meaning people who, if they see a democratic vote, will then follow the standard because it's been voted democratically. The problem is that the standard which gets created by this process is not capable of being followed because it's full of confusions and contradictions, I think. Now, with regard to let a million ontologies bloom, here I think one important element is the history of artificial intelligence research. People for a long time thought that if you just put enough information into the computer and do certain things, then the computer will, at some threshold point, start to think. And there are still remnants of this dream alive within the semantic web world. And certainly Doug Lenert used to be a remnant of this dream, or used to relish this dream. I hope he's abandoned it by now. But if he hasn't, that's also good. But there are other elements too. The element of non-authoritarianism. So the computer world, semantic web world, is very anti-authoritarian. They want people to be free. They want the teenagers to do that thing. They don't like to tell people that they're doing the wrong thing. And you can't create gigantic computational scientific edifices without authoritarianism. But they won't give me the right authority to